The sleek, polished floors of Washington National Airport reflected the overhead lights like pools of silver as airport security manager Thomas Reynolds made the biggest mistake of his 15-year career. Standing tall in his crisp blue uniform, Reynolds pointed toward the exit, while a distinguished gentleman in an impeccable suit stood silently, his security detail exchanging concerned glances. The bustling terminal fell into an eerie silence. As passengers stopped to witness the unfolding drama, phones raised to capture what would soon become a national scandal. Little did Reynolds know that the man he was dismissing from the VIP lounge, due to an apparent credential verification issue, was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and this misstep would cascade into a series of events that would test the limits of his professional composure, especially when Air Force One was just 30 minutes from landing. Thomas Reynolds had started his shift like any other Tuesday morning, sipping his black coffee and scanning the day's security protocols with meticulous attention. The airport was operating under heightened security measures due to several diplomatic delegations arriving for the International Peace Summit. Reynolds prided himself on running the tightest security operation in the Eastern Seaboard, with a spotless record and commendations from the Department of Homeland Security. His team respected his unwavering dedication to protocol, even when it meant occasionally ruffling the feathers of entitled passengers who thought rules didn't apply to them. The early spring weather had brought clear skies, perfect for landings and departures, with the cherry blossoms beginning to bloom around the capital, creating a picturesque backdrop to what was supposed to be a routine day of operations. Reynolds had no idea that his adherence to procedure without proper verification would soon place him at the center of a diplomatic incident that would reach the highest office in the land. The incident began when Secretary Rubio arrived without his usual entourage, having separated from them to take an urgent call regarding delicate negotiations with European allies. His security detail was minimal, with only 2 agents accompanying him instead of the usual team, and in the rush there had been a communication breakdown about his arrival time. The secretary's credentials appeared to have a discrepancy when scanned through the system, triggering Reynolds' by-the-book response. Despite the secretary's calm explanation and the protests of his security detail, Reynolds remained unmoved, citing security protocols and the system alert. As Rubio was escorted toward the regular terminal, away from the diplomatic lounge, whispers began spreading through the airport staff, and a junior employee's eyes widened in recognition as she frantically typed on her phone, searching for confirmation of the secretary's identity. The ticking clock continued its relentless march forward, with each passing minute bringing President Trump's arrival closer and the magnitude of Reynolds' error into sharper focus. Thomas Reynolds' assistant, Sarah Chen, rushed toward him with panic etched across her face, clutching her tablet with white knuckles as security camera footage captured her desperate sprint through the terminal. She had been cross-referencing the credential anomaly and discovered that the system had recently undergone an update that occasionally flagged certain high-level diplomatic credentials for secondary verification. The man they had just escorted from the VIP lounge was indeed Secretary of State Marco Rubio, one of the president's closest advisors and the architect of the administration's groundbreaking Middle East peace initiative. Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face as he processed this information, his mind racing through the potential professional repercussions while security protocols dictated that once removed, re-entry required a complete new security clearance process. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the secretary now needed to be located in the sprawling main terminal where he had been directed, all while the advance team for President Trump had begun arriving to prepare for the imminent landing of Air Force One. Meanwhile, Secretary Rubio maintained his composure in the public terminal, though the inconvenience was significant given his need to prepare for the president's arrival and the sensitive diplomatic materials he was meant to present. The secretary's security detail had already contacted their superiors, setting off alarm bells throughout the State Department and White House communication channels. Airport staff were now scrambling to locate the secretary, with Reynolds personally leading the search party, while simultaneously trying to implement proper protocols for the high-level error correction. The airport's general manager had been notified and was racing back from an off-site meeting, already fielding calls from increasingly senior government officials demanding explanations. Security cameras tracked the secretary's movement through the general terminal, where he had taken a seat in a quiet corner, reviewing documents on his secure tablet, seemingly unruffled by the situation, though clearly displaced from where he needed to be. The airport's communication system pinged with increasing urgency as the presidential arrival timeline continued to advance, creating a pressure cooker situation for all involved. The tension escalated when White House Chief of Staff Michael Anderson called the airport's secure line, his authoritative voice echoing through the speaker in the security office with unmistakable displeasure. Anderson made it abundantly clear that the president expected to be greeted by Secretary Rubio upon landing, as they had critical national security matters to discuss before proceeding to the summit. Reynolds wiped beads of sweat from his brow as he coordinated with his team via radio, directing them to establish a proper escort for the secretary back to the diplomatic area with the highest priority. The airport's operations began adjusting to the situation, with subtle shifts in security personnel and a quiet clearing of a path from the main terminal back to the diplomatic reception area. Time seemed to accelerate as the radar showed Air Force One making its final approach to Washington airspace, the distinctive blue and white aircraft carrying not just the president but the weight of Reynolds' professional future. The pressure mounted with each passing second, the consequences of the mistake growing from embarrassing to potentially career-ending as news began reaching more senior levels of government. Thomas Reynolds finally located Secretary Rubio, approaching him with a combination of professional urgency and personal mortification that manifested in a slight tremor in his hands. The secretary looked up from his tablet, his expression revealing nothing, as Reynolds apologized profusely and explained the system error while requesting that the secretary accompany him immediately back to the diplomatic reception area. To Reynolds' surprise, Rubio responded with unexpected grace, standing calmly and gathering his belongings while his security detail maintained their vigilant positions around him. The secretary's only comment was a measured reminder about the importance of human verification in addition to technological systems, delivered not with anger, but as a thoughtful observation that cut deeper than any reprimand could have. The entourage moved swiftly through the terminal, with airport staff clearing a path and curious onlookers wondering about the VIP receiving such attentive treatment. The precious minutes continued to evaporate as they navigated back through security checkpoints, with Reynolds personally overriding protocols to expedite the process while maintaining necessary security measures, all too aware that the margin for error had completely disappeared. With just 7 minutes until the scheduled landing of Air Force One, Secretary Rubio was finally reinstated in the diplomatic reception area, though the smooth operation that should have characterized such a high-profile arrival had been irreparably disrupted. Reynolds stood at the edge of the secure area, his career flashing before his eyes, as he contemplated the best approach to explaining the situation to the presidential detail upon their arrival. The airport's general manager had arrived and was deep in conversation with State Department officials, occasionally casting glances in Reynolds' direction that ranged from concern to barely concealed anger. Security personnel moved with increased urgency throughout the terminal, with every available officer called to their positions as the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the approach of the presidential motorcade escort. Reynolds couldn't help but notice that despite the chaos he had inadvertently created, Secretary Rubio had resumed his preparations with focused professionalism, reviewing briefing materials with his team as though the incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The contrast between the secretary's composed demeanor and Reynolds' internal panic only heightened his sense of dread as the moment of truth approached with the inescapable momentum of a freight train. The terminal fell into a respectful hush. As President Trump's motorcade arrived, the formidable presidential limousine gleaming under the midday sun as it came to a perfect stop at the designated reception point. Reynolds stood at attention, his posture rigid with tension as the president emerged, cutting an imposing figure in his tailored suit as he surveyed the assembled greeting party. The president's sharp eyes immediately noted Secretary Rubio's position, slightly off from the usual protocol arrangement, a detail that wouldn't escape someone known for his attention to the choreography of official appearances. Reynolds could feel his career balancing on a knife's edge as the president approached Secretary Rubio, their exchange of greetings visible, but their conversation inaudible from his position. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on Reynolds as he observed the body language of the two powerful men, searching for any indication of how the incident might be addressed, while the presidential security detail maintained their watchful positions with characteristic stoicism that revealed nothing of their thoughts regarding the disrupted protocols. Secretary Rubio leaned in to speak privately with the president, their conversation shielded from observers as they walked slowly toward the airport's diplomatic suite. Reynolds maintained his professional position, though he couldn't help but notice when both men glanced in his direction, the president's expression unreadable as Secretary Rubio appeared to be explaining something with measured hand gestures. The president nodded thoughtfully, his response causing the secretary to straighten slightly, in what Reynolds desperately hoped was a positive sign rather than an agreement about punitive measures. The presidential entourage continued their progress through the terminal, with staff and security moving in their carefully choreographed dance of protection and efficiency. Reynolds received word through his earpiece that he was requested to join the airport general manager in the diplomatic suite once the president and secretary had been escorted to their private meeting room, an instruction that sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through his system. The uncertainty of what awaited him in that meeting room hung over Reynolds like a guillotine blade, suspended by an increasingly frayed thread as he contemplated whether 15 years of exemplary service could be erased by one catastrophic error in judgment. To Reynolds' utter astonishment, when he was finally ushered into the diplomatic suite's antechamber, he found not a termination notice but President Trump himself, standing with Secretary Rubio and the airport's general manager in what appeared to be a surprisingly relaxed conversation. The president turned to acknowledge Reynolds' entrance, his commanding presence filling the room as he addressed the security manager directly. Instead of the expected reprimand, the president commended Reynolds for maintaining strict security protocols even when faced with high-ranking officials, noting that such diligence was precisely what American security required in increasingly complex times. Secretary Rubio added that while the situation had been inconvenient, he respected professionals who followed proper procedures rather than making exceptions that could compromise security standards. The relief that washed over Reynolds was tempered by professional humility as he acknowledged the system failure while accepting responsibility for not implementing better human verification processes. The president's focus on the importance of both technological and human elements in security operations transformed what could have been a career-ending disaster into an unexpected presidential endorsement of rigorous security measures, regardless of the status of those being screened. In the days that followed, the airport implemented new verification protocols based on recommendations from Secretary Rubio's security team, with Thomas Reynolds playing a key role in their development and implementation. The incident, rather than becoming a scandal, was transformed into a case study in security excellence, with presidential approval elevating what could have been Reynolds' greatest failure into his most significant professional achievement. Airport staff noticed a subtle but meaningful change in their security manager's approach, with Reynolds maintaining his commitment to protocols while developing a more nuanced understanding of the human elements that technology alone couldn't address. The cherry blossoms reached full bloom around Washington as spring fully arrived, their delicate beauty a reminder of how quickly situations could transform from barren to magnificent with the right conditions and perspective. Secretary Rubio made a point of acknowledging Reynolds during his next pass through the airport, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the unexpected bridges that had been built through what had initially seemed like an insurmountable professional chasm. The international press that had initially gathered in anticipation of a scandal instead reported on the administration's commitment to security excellence at all levels, turning potential embarrassment into diplomatic capital that Secretary Rubio leveraged skillfully in subsequent international negotiations. Thomas Reynolds stood at the observation deck 1 month after the incident, watching flights take off and land with the precise choreography that characterized well-executed airport operations. The spring sunshine illuminated the runway as Air Force One made another perfect landing, carrying President Trump and Secretary Rubio back from successful international negotiations that had built upon the foundation of credibility established partly through the airport incident. Reynolds had been invited to a White House security briefing the following week, his expertise now sought at the highest levels of government, a development that would have seemed impossible in those tense moments when he realized his mistake. His team operated with renewed confidence and improved processes, the lessons from that day integrated into training programs being adopted by airports nationwide. As Reynolds watched the presidential motorcade move smoothly across the tarmac, he reflected on how a potentially career-ending mistake had transformed into the defining moment of his professional life, not through minimizing the error, but by embracing the opportunity for improvement it presented. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance beyond the airport boundaries, a fitting symbol of the enduring strength that could emerge from properly addressed challenges as Reynolds turned back to his duty station, approaching his responsibilities with the balanced perspective of someone who had faced professional disaster and emerged stronger on the other side.